Hello. Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone around the world. It is Thursday, my friends, and we are here for another Theory Thursday. Apologies if I'm not in the best of spirits. As I said, there is still a lot going on in the world. It's hard for me to be in a bright mood, but I'm not going to try and carry negativity to the stream, I promise. As I said, no matter what's going on in the world, I will always try to stream on Thursdays, always. Because I started this channel to provide a place for free education. That's why this stream exists. I want to help people who want to learn. So, no matter what's going on, I can't guarantee when challenges or interviews or podcasts or feedback will be back. I can't promise a specific date. It might be next week that we're back to some sort of normal. It might be next month. I don't know. I can't give you all a specific date yet. I apologize. I sincerely apologize from the bottom of my heart. I do. But if I go to protests, I will stream that. But Theory Thursday will always happen. I will always be here to answer your questions. I'll always be here to help you learn. I do want to take a brief side conversation. It is sort of still theory stuff, but it's not music theory. If that's okay with all of you, I would like to talk a little bit about a little bit of politics and a little bit of reading that I think might be helpful if you want to understand the current situation that we're in the United States. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable, so if this is a sensitive topic for you, if it makes you uncomfortable, I also understand. I would recommend maybe taking like a, I don't know, hour-long break, not even 30 minutes, 45 minutes. I don't think it'll take much longer than 30. But I do hope that you stick around. I'm not going to try and get inflammatory. I'm just going to speak my opinions on something. What I wanted to talk about first, if it's all right with y'all, are three books that I would say made me more politically conscious. Arguably, you could say they radicalized me. They made me much more incensed about the way of the world, and two of them were released by the United States government. So it's not like I'm reading some fringe literature. I'm reading just books by the people who I am angry at, basically. And then one that's not. One that might be a little bit expected or unexpected if you've been on this stream more than once. And then two that I think will be a bit revealing. I wanted to talk about three books that really influenced me as a politically minded person. I mean, I've always pretty much been someone who's been politically minded. I was involved in like conservationist groups in middle and high school. I was the vice president and the president of my school's Gay Straight Alliance when I was in high school. I've always been either liberal or left of center. I would say I've gotten more left, less liberal over time, but it's been a process of kind of teaching myself and listening to other people, most importantly, and reading what other people have to say. And I don't really have a specific marker for my ideology right now. I would say I'm definitely in the very far left-leaning camp, but there's a couple of different theories out there that I am not sure which one I ascribe to first and foremost. So I would just consider myself just a broad leftist. So the first book, obviously, that I would recommend or that I would say really influenced me was the good old Communist Manifesto by your boys Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It took me actually a long time to read this, which is silly because it's a tiny book. This is not a thick book. The other books we're going to show are pretty hefty, I will admit. But the Communist Manifesto, you wouldn't even need to buy a physical copy of this. You can find it online. It's less than 100 pages. It's a pamphlet, but it creates a concept of how you can understand the different systems that have existed throughout history. I'm a big proponent of studying history, and looking at it not through purely an objective, like this is what history is perspective, but rather history has been written in certain ways, and it is written by certain people. Not necessarily the victors, not necessarily the winners, but it has always been written with a specific narrative in mind. And this book offers a separate narrative for the way that history has gone. And it argues for a separate classification of history, and it boils it down into a struggle between two separate and opposing forces or classes of people. You have the bourgeoisie, or the people who have maintained the positions of control. These are the kings. These are the lords. These are the emperors. These are the bosses. These are the CEOs. These are the people who maintain control over the production of goods, services, commodities, and essentially livelihoods for the second class of people, which would be the proletariat. These would be the slaves. These would be the serfs. These would be the peasants. These would be the workers, the laborers, the people who create all of the things that the upper class sells to each other and back to the working class. And I'm not going to tell you that this has all the answers. This is literally a pamphlet. It's a leaflet. It's less than 100 pages, 200 pages. I think the whole thing, including the whole thing here, which includes like a 10-page foreword by some person who's not Marx and Engels, the whole thing is 87 pages. That's the very last page. And that's not even the actual thing. The actual pamphlet is like, again, 50 pages. This also has a foreword and a secondary edition written after the fact. But the core document, I recommend you look at. It's not going to give you a lot of data. That would come in Das Kapital, Capital, the book that, or the multi-part book that Karl Marx wrote that provides a more scientific historical analysis of things like class, things like money, things like the economy. And I think even if you don't consider yourself a socialist or a communist, it is good to understand the perspective of those who are on the left flank so that you can understand where our motivations come from. We are looking for a way to reduce or eliminate that imbalance, remove those two fundamental classes that get essentially mapped onto most other conflicts that we see in society. A lot of people talk about how, like in America, for example, race and class are inexorably linked. Obviously, you can be rich and poor in any race, but you are disproportionately more likely to be poor if you are a minority group. If you are Black or African American, if you are Hispanic or Latino or Latina, and even in some cases, if you are, or at least in the past, if you were Asian, it became systemically harder for you to achieve success. And this is something that has existed throughout the history of the United States. A book that's not along this list of three that I could recommend is How the Irish Became White. I'm blanking on the author's name. Let me actually pull that up on my other screen real quick. How the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatiev. I'll show it to you right here. This is the book, How the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatiev. I read this book back in like 2007 or 2008, and it talks about sort of this concept of whiteness as essentially an amorphous blob of the in-group and the out-group. Arguably the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the owners and the workers. Another good book to talk about race would be White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. You can find that right here. I read this book. This is another really good book, not on the list of three that we're going to talk about, but connected with this concept of race and class in America. Definitely a really worthwhile book to read into if you find yourself wondering why people make such broad categorizations about white people when discussing issues of race. How it might feel like we're making generalizations about white people, that we are making some sort of categorization about all white people when we're supposedly trying to dissolve that concept of race. And this book, I think, will help illustrate that. Which is actually a good transition into the second book that I would really recommend you read, one of the big books that made me more radical. And this book was written by the government, technically. It is the Justice Department's report on Ferguson, Missouri, and the Ferguson Police Department. During the aftermath of the Michael Brown shooting about 6 years ago. Actually, just under 6 years ago, August 9th, 2014, was the shooting of Michael Brown, an unarmed black man, by a police officer. And that was one of the earlier examples of what we're seeing right now with George Floyd. So you can see the connecting thread between this story, this report, and what's happening right now, which is to say, this has been going on for a long time. This details the extensive racist actions, intentional and unintentional, by the Ferguson Police Department, and it offers insight into possible motivations as to why. Part of it is that the police force has always had racist elements to the system of policing. The way that the police force operates is just by design going to disproportionately affect innocent black people more than it will affect innocent white people. It talks about the way that more and more of the police office's budget, or the police department's budget, was based on essentially fines and tickets as a profit-generating resource. So in addition to the nature of the police department to just unfortunately by design be racist and affect black people more, there was also an incentive to squeeze money out of the people that the police department was focusing on, whether they were white or black or some other person of color. And this is one of the big books that when this came out, when I read this book, it really changed a lot of the way I think about race in America and a lot about the ways that I think about policing in America. Because not every cop is going to be bad, but if the system of policing is bad, if the way that the entire police department, the way the entire police department operates is bad, and it doesn't matter how good the person is, the system either converts them, controls them, or removes them. And I really recommend that if you're able to handle what's going on in these stories, you should read this book. Or at the very least, you should look up the findings of this report, because this is an official U.S. Justice Department investigation. And speaking of investigations and things that are really hard to handle, this is going to be not only the densest book, because we're going up in density. As you can see, the Ferguson report is pretty thick compared to the Communist Manifesto. As you can see, I started you out easy, okay? This might be the most contentious one of the three, but it's also the easiest one to read, so you probably should just start with this one. But the biggest thing for me in my radicalization process, someone who became more untrustworthy of the government apparatus, but more inclined to participate in the government process to try and change it, was this book right here. The Senate Committee on Intelligence, their report on the U.S. torture program, but this documents through the Bush and the Obama administrations use of torture throughout the post 9/11 era. This book will completely change the way you think about our intelligence agencies, about the arguments in favor of torture. Not just because of the methods they use in this book, okay? This book describes some really just abhorrent, just disgusting, in my opinion, immoral behavior. Just cruel, unusual, inhumane. Just, it blew my mind to read what was happening. And this was in the words of the U.S. government revealing this information. A lot of stuff in the book is still blacked out. But, funnily enough, the page that I am currently at is a list of CIA detainees between the years of 2002 and 2008. I see people with at least 4 to 5 digits of days, okay? Not 4 to 5 days, 4 to 5 digits of days. So thousands to tens of thousands of days spent in detention camps such as Guantanamo Bay without trial, without an attorney, without any of the legal rights that we have as American citizens or international citizens on U.S. soil. None of that was applied, and they were held for years, literal years, thousands, if not tens of thousands of days. And we got nothing. We got literally nothing out of this. We got negative advice out of this that actually helped us. The amount of information that was gleaned from these tortures did nothing to advance our agenda of stopping torture. Because, surprise, surprise, when you're in pain, when someone's hurting you and you just want the pain to stop, You will say whatever you have to in order to make the pain stop, even if it's not true, even if it's just what they want to hear. You will say it just to make the pain stop. There were reports in this given to the CIA, given to intelligence agencies about, oh, this is an attack we'll do. And the CIA bought it, even though it was something that was so ludicrously absurd that if you had looked at it from any other perspective, you would have wondered how the CIA had even thought it would work. Like a secret Al-Qaeda training camp in the mountains of Montana. Do you know how many Muslims there are in Montana? There's probably like 3 total in the entire state. And above all else, this is what made me want not only revolutionary politics, where we change the system, but top to bottom, total involvement politics, direct action and electoralism, civil disobedience, and participating in local, state, and federal governmental processes. Because we, as a country, have the power to stop this. We need the will, and we need the, essentially, agitation, like we're having right now, with all the shit that's going on. It took a week of protests for the 4 officers involved in George Floyd's death to be charged. Not to be indicted, not even to go through the process and convict them, because it has to take time, but just to charge them. It took a week of protests, thousands of people arrested. And I think if you're looking for a way to understand my perspective, these are 3 books that might be a really good starting point. There's obviously a lot of other books. I mentioned 2 more, How the Irish Became White and White Fragility, which deal more with concepts of race in America. Obviously, if you're in Europe, there's going to be different concepts of race. A lot of what we're talking about right now deals with specifically American race theory, which is an almost exclusively American thing, but because of the cultural dominance of America, has spread throughout the world. We all know what intrinsically these things mean, even if it's not, as Galaxy is saying, it's not something that is conceptualized within Europe, which is not to say that there is not racism in Europe. I know an example of a French football player who has gotten pretty upset when people have referred to him as like African, not as French. He considers himself French, but others create him or put him into this designation as like Afro-French or African French national kind of thing. And there's definitely stories of racism throughout Europe. So not to say that Europe is free from it, but yes, a lot of these concepts that we're talking about deal with American race theory, which is something that has a long history to itself as far back as Thomas Jefferson trying to find a justification as for why he could keep slaves, because he considered himself an enlightened man. He considered himself someone who understood the rights of men, of humans, as equals. So in order to justify to himself how he could keep other human beings as property, he basically went to the scientists of the day and said, hey, can you help me figure out why black people should be slaves? And since the question wasn't are or should we, not just a blanket, like, just not like yes or no, like should we do it, but rather why should we do it? What is the justification we can make? And it is a really interesting thing once you start reading into it. As you can maybe see, I have a lot of other books. My bookcase broke, so I'm still kind of organizing all that shit and figuring out what I'm going to do with that. But as you can see, I like books and I like reading about stuff, so I've read about a lot of these things, and it is kind of wild. It is kind of wild here when you start seeing all these different concepts that emerge. But I saw Owsly had a recommendation on intersectionality, the essential writings of Kimberly Crenshaw. Definitely a really good book that I haven't read, but I've heard of. There are plenty of books that we could talk about, like The People's History of the United States is one that I really want to read that I've been putting off for easily years now. And there are a lot of books that we could go into. If anyone else has recommendations on books that like made them more conscious of what goes on outside of their own world. Because like for these last two books, remember, I'm neither of the people that would be affected by these. This focuses on mostly the lives of African Americans and Black people in the United States. This mostly refers to the lives of Muslim Americans in the United States. I am neither an African American nor am I a Muslim American. I am a Jewish American. I'm white. I'm male presenting. I am essentially normative presenting. I don't present as neurodiverse. I present as neurotypical. So I am not the one who is going to be affected by any of that stuff. But by reading those stories, by reading those reports, it helped me think about what's going on outside of myself. And I think that is just as important, if not more important, than just what affects you. Now, I have plenty of books that talk about issues that only affect me. I have plenty of books on anti-Semitism, on the Israel-Palestine conflict, things that directly affect me for sure. Plenty of stuff about music's in there. But that's what I'm saying. Like, if you have any recommendations on things that taught you about people that were not yourself, I would love to hear those recommendations, either in chat or in the Discord. I would just love to hear people's reading lists, frankly, because it's important for me to learn what you all are studying and not just me tell you what I'm studying. Because I think learning is a cooperative exercise. It's a two-way street. I learn from these streams as much as I teach in these streams. So thank you for that recommendation, Owsly. Thank you for that recommendation, Archer. Both really interesting books that I want to check out.